In the fall of 1863, out in a western Missouri county still labeled Blackwater on old maps, 9 entire households vanished before harvest season ended. Not 9 individuals, 9 complete families. Men, women, children, grandparents, hired help, even the dogs that slept under the porches. By the time the first killing frost hit in November, 9 farmsteads sat abandoned, their doors swinging in the wind. Half-eaten meals still on the tables. Cradles rocking in the draft. Bibles left open to the very page the family had been reading when whatever happened, happened. The county clerk who first logged the disappearances was dead before Christmas. He'd sealed his ledger inside a locked cabinet at the Jefferson City State House, where it sat for over 60 years. When a historian finally pried it open in the 1920s, he found a single sheet of paper pinned to the inside cover, written in a trembling hand. On it were 4 words that have never been fully explained. Before we go further into the story of Blackwater County, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because what you're about to hear is the kind of history that was deliberately buried, and the people who buried it counted on everyone forgetting. Those 4 words were, they took them willing. To understand why a county clerk in western Missouri would scrawl that phrase before drinking a bottle of laudanum in a Sedalia boarding house, dying of what the coroner politely called nervous exhaustion, you first have to understand what Blackwater County was like in the summer of 1863, and what it had already become by the time the last family disappeared. You have to understand a particular kind of American darkness, one that wears no uniform, flies no flag, but thrives in the gray spaces between flags. It flourishes when the ordinary rules between neighbors have been suspended by the larger cruelty of the world. You have to understand what a civil war does to the land and to the people on it. When the armies are far away, and the only soldiers you ever see are the ones who knock on your door after midnight. Blackwater County sat along the lower Blackwater River, a slow brown stream that fed into the Lamine and then the Missouri. The land was good, not the rich black soil of the lower Mississippi, but rolling prairie cut by timber, with limestone outcrops, clear springs, and enough flat ground between the hills to raise proper crops of hemp, tobacco, and winter wheat. Families had been settling there since the 1830s. Most came up from Kentucky and Tennessee by flatboat and wagon, bringing the accents and stubborn Scotch, Irish pride of the Upper South. They brought their ballots and their feuds, their cornbread recipes and their whiskey recipes, their distrust of strangers and their fierce loyalty to kin. They brought a hard edge bred from 3 generations of clearing timber and breaking sod. But underneath it, a softness that came out at barn raisings, weddings, and funerals. That softness would eventually be used against them. By 1860, the county held just over 4,000 people scattered across some 600 farms, with 2 small towns at the crossroads and a 3rd settlement down by the river landing, where steamboats used to call before the war. That landing was called Marlowe's Ferry, and it had grain warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and 3 saloons. Upstream at the crossroads of the old state road and the military road stood the county seat, New Salisbury, with a red brick courthouse, a stone jail, a bank, 2 churches, and a line of storefronts facing the square. Everyone came to New Salisbury twice a year, once to pay taxes, once for the fall circuit court. Everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by name. Most families weren't rich. A few owned enslaved people, usually 1 or 2 house servants and a field hand or 2. But most were plain farmers who worked their own land with their own sons. They went to church on Sundays at small white, frame meeting houses. They buried their dead in family plots on the back 40. and they trusted their neighbors because they had to. The nearest doctor was 11 miles away in good weather, 3 days away in bad. If a child took a fever at midnight, you didn't wait. You rode to the nearest farmhouse and knocked. And the man who opened the door, no matter his politics, or how tired he was, or what grudge might have stood between your families, would take down his coat and ride back with you through the dark. That trust, that web of small loyalties between neighbors, was the first thing the war destroyed. Missouri in 1863 wasn't a battlefield like Virginia. No great armies marched across it in blue and gray lines. No Gettysburgs, no Antietam's, no long fields of corpses laid out for photographers. What it had instead was something older, more intimate, and far more terrible. A war of neighbor against neighbor. The boy who'd kissed your daughter last spring, now riding up your lane with a pistol and a grudge. The man who'd helped you raise your barn now, informing on your husband to the Home Guard. The state had officially declared for the Union, but in the western counties, where the Missouri River bent south toward Kansas, loyalties were split right down the middle of every family and every congregation. Brothers rode for opposite sides. Fathers disowned sons. Wives denounced husbands from the pulpit. And into that broken country came the bushwhackers. They called themselves partisan rangers or guerrillas or simply the boys. The Union called them murderers. They rode in small bands of 10 or 20, armed with revolvers and shotguns, moving through the timber and river bottoms like ghosts. They burned out Union sympathizers, ambushed federal patrols, and lived off the land, demanding meals, fodder, and horses from civilian farms. Woe to the family that said no. On the other side, the Home Guard and the enrolled Missouri militia, often staffed by men with private scores to settle, rode up the same lanes in blue coats and did much the same work, only with state authority behind them. A farmer in Blackwater County that summer might be robbed at breakfast by one armed band and robbed at supper by another. Neither band would feel any obligation to leave him alive when they were finished. In a war where everyone is guilty of something, killing a witness is just good housekeeping. The most famous bushwhacker, a lean-faced schoolteacher named William Clark Quantrill, had ridden into Lawrence, Kansas on the morning of August 21, 1863, with 450 men at his back. By sunset, 150 unarmed civilians lay dead in the streets, and the entire town center was burning. Every household in Blackwater County knew the story of Lawrence by the first week of September, and every household understood what it meant. The rules, whatever rules there had ever been, were finished. If a man with 400 horsemen could ride into a town of 2,000 and kill men and boys in their nightshirts while their wives watched, then nothing was safe. No door was thick enough. No neighbor could be counted on. The federal response to Lawrence came 4 days later, on August 25th, in the form of a single piece of paper, signed by Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, Jr., commanding the District of the Border. It was called General Order No. 11. It instructed every person living in 4 western Missouri counties, Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern half of Vernon, to abandon their homes within 15 days. They could take what they could carry. Everything else would be seized or burned. The purpose, Ewing wrote, was to deny the bushwhackers their civilian support base by emptying the country of civilians altogether. Families who had lived there for 40 years were given 2 weeks to become refugees. 20,000 people were turned out onto the roads before the first frost. The land they left behind was known for a generation as the Burnt District. What Ewing didn't put in writing, but what every officer under his command understood, was that the 4 named counties weren't the only ones where the order would be enforced. In practice, any county within a day's ride of the Kansas line, and any county where guerrilla activity was reported could be treated the same way at local commanders' discretion. Blackwater County wasn't on the official list, but by mid-September 1863, it had a small federal garrison stationed at the county seat. And that garrison was commanded by a captain from Illinois named Josiah Pickering. And Captain Pickering had been given a great deal of discretion indeed. This is the country. And this is the moment in which 9 families disappeared. The first to go was the Hollister family. Ephraim Hollister was 51, a widower with 4 grown children still at home and 2 grandchildren in a back bedroom. His wife had died of milk sickness in 1858, and he'd raised the youngest with the help of his oldest daughter Rebecca, whose husband had been killed at Wilson's Creek in Sickton. 61. Ephraim owned 160 acres on the eastern branch of the Blackwater. A good cabin with a stone chimney, a spring house, a smoke house, a tobacco barn, and a team of Belgian draft horses. He was known as a quiet man, a fair dealer, a strict Baptist who didn't drink or curse, and a reliable neighbor who had never turned anyone away from his door. On the morning of September 14, 1863, a man named Asa Crenshaw rode over to borrow a whetstone. Crenshaw was 63, a Methodist lay preacher with a limp from a horse accident in his youth. He'd known Ephraim for 22 years. They'd helped each other at every harvest since before the war, buried each other's wives, and shared a jug of peach brandy on the porch the previous 4th of July, arguing about the war until the moon went down. When Crenshaw rode into the Hollister yard that morning, the dogs were gone. That was the first thing he noticed. The Hollisters kept 3 hounds and a yellow mongrel, and none of them came out. The second thing, the chickens were still scratching in the yard, and nobody had thrown them corn. Ephraim threw corn to the chickens every morning before breakfast. You could set a watch by it. The third thing, the front door stood half open, and a gingham apron was caught on the latch, flapping in the breeze. Crenshaw called out. No answer. He tied his mule, walked onto the porch, and stood there with his hand on the doorframe, listening. The silence coming out of the cabin was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that has a shape to it. The kind a countryman recognizes the way he recognizes an approaching storm. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast for 7 people. Cornbread sat cold in the skillet on the hearth, a knife beside it. A pitcher of buttermilk had curdled in the warm morning air, a fly walking on its rim. 7 plates, 7 tin cups, 7 places laid with knives and spoons. Not one touched. A half-peeled apple lay on a cutting board, the peel still attached in one long spiral, as if the hand holding the knife had simply put it down and walked away. The back bedroom, where Rebecca slept with her 2 children, was empty, the bed unmade, the quilt pulled back as if she'd risen to answer a call. A child's ragdoll lay on the floor, with one button eye missing. The loft where the 3 sons slept was empty. A clean shirt lay folded on a bed as if someone had been about to put it on. Outside, the draft horses were still in the barn, the wagon still under the lean-to. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken. No blood, no sign of struggle, no fresh wagon tracks. The only thing out of place was the family Bible. It always sat on a shelf above the hearth, but it had been taken down and laid open on the table face up next to the cornbread skillet. The page it was open to was Psalm 37. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass. Crenshaw rode to the county seat that afternoon and reported the Hollisters missing to Sheriff Reuben Vaughn. Vaughn was a tired man who'd been trying to hold the county together with his bare hands since the war started. He rode out the next morning with 2 deputies and found exactly what Crenshaw had described. He wrote a brief report, filed it with the county clerk, looked at the open Bible for a long time, then closed it gently, put it back on the shelf, and walked out. He stood on the porch in the cool September air and felt, for the first time in his 11 years as sheriff, a fear that had nothing to do with bullets or blades. It was a fear of the absence of sound, a fear of 7 place settings untouched. But there was a war on. People disappeared in Missouri every week for 100 different reasons. So Vaughn did what any sheriff would have done. He put the Hollister case in the back of a drawer and waited to see if anyone came back. No one came back. 6 days later, the Tillman family was gone. 8 people, including a bedridden grandmother of 70, 4 who couldn't walk. Her cabin was found exactly the same. A meal laid out, beds unmade, livestock hungry but alive. No blood, no tracks. The grandmother had been carried out so gently that her glass of laudanum on the bedside table hadn't even spilled. 4 days after that, the Lamb family vanished. 9 people. The Lamb girl, Sarah, had been engaged to a boy from the next county. Her wedding dress was found laid out on her bed, finished, pinned, ready for the final fitting. A small bouquet of pressed flowers tied with a blue ribbon sat on the pillow beside it. The boy she was to marry rode over when he heard the news and sat on the edge of her bed for 2 hours without moving. When he finally spoke, he said Sarah wouldn't have left that dress behind, not for the devil himself. She'd been working on it for 7 months. If she'd walked out and left it, then she hadn't walked out. Somebody had walked her out. 3 weeks later, he was found hanged in his father's barn. The coroner ruled it suicide. His father never entirely agreed. By October 1st, Sheriff Vaughn had 3 empty houses on his desk and a growing certainty that this wasn't the work of ordinary bushwhackers. Bushwhackers took horses, food, and revenge. They didn't take entire families and leave the horses behind. They didn't take grandmothers who couldn't walk. And they certainly didn't take people so quietly that nobody within 3 miles heard a single gunshot or scream. The Lamb farm lay within 800 yards of Asa Crenshaw's place. And Crenshaw had been awake that whole night with a sick calf. He'd heard nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no barking dogs. Nothing except, once around 2 a.m., the faint squeak of a wagon axle on the river road. On October 3rd, Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and asked Captain Josiah Pickering for help. Pickering was a thin man of 34, sharp, featured with a close, cropped beard and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with a penknife while others spoke. He listened to Vaughan's account with professional concern, asked a few quiet questions about the farm's locations, and asked whether any of the missing families had been known to harbor guerrilla sympathies. Vaughn said not that he knew. Pickering nodded thoughtfully, wrote something in a small leather notebook, and told the sheriff that the disappearances were almost certainly the work of guerrillas. The garrison had neither the men nor the orders to investigate civilian disappearances in an active war zone. Vaughn should go home and tend to the living. Vaughn left with a cold feeling he couldn't put into words. 20 years later, on his deathbed, he would try to explain it to his grandson. It was the feeling of speaking to a man who already knew the answer to every question you were asking him, and who was waiting politely for you to stop asking. And it was the feeling of being measured like a pig at market by eyes that had already decided what price you were worth. In the weeks that followed, as the Missouri sky turned from September blue to October pewter and the first hard frosts came down, 6 more families vanished. The Corbins, the Osgoods, taken from a fine 2-story clapboard house with a library of 40 books and a rosewood piano. Mrs. Osgood had played every evening. The McCaskills, 11 people. including 2 hired hands, taken from a big working farm with a dairy herd that was still lowing in the barn the next morning. A family named Grizzly, a family named Wagner, and finally, on the night of November 15, 1863, a family named Beaumont. 10 people, the largest household in the county, vanished from a cabin less than 2 miles from the federal garrison itself. 9 households, 67 people, not one body, not one witness, not one shot fired. The community's response was not outrage or panic. It was something colder, the slow shrinkage of the human animal into itself. Curtains pulled, shutters locked. A quiet agreement not to ride out after dark and not to ask too many questions in daylight. By the first week of November, people had stopped visiting each other for supper. By the second week, they'd stopped waving from their wagons. Churches emptied. The general store reported that women were sending their husbands to buy flour because the women no longer wanted to leave the farms, even for an hour. On the farms themselves, families slept in shifts. One man or boy awake at all times with a loaded shotgun across his knees, watching the road and the tree line by the light of a single low candle. But the thing they couldn't protect themselves against was not the thing they were watching for. They were watching for bushwhackers, for strangers, for the galloping hoofbeats of Quantrill's men. What they were not watching for was a polite knock at the door around 10 o'clock at night, and a familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, and a quiet voice speaking words that could almost be misspoken for kindness. Decades later, the empty farms passed into regional folklore. Travelers in the 1870s and 80s reported seeing lamps lit in windows of houses that had been abandoned for 20 years. A journalist from the Kansas City Star rode through in 1891 and called the region the County of Empty Tables, because that, he said, was what every homestead contained: an empty table set for a meal nobody had lived to eat. Schoolchildren told stories about the Hollister cabin, the ghost of the little girl who'd left her rag doll, the sound of an apple peel unrolling in an empty room. But the folklore was wrong. The tables hadn't been empty when the families left. They'd been full, and whoever, or whatever, had taken those families had done so not in haste or fear, but with a patience and completeness that suggested something far worse than a bushwhacker raid. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, hit the like button and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in Blackwater County. I read every comment, and your ideas shape the stories I tell next. Now let's go back to what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn began to find when he finally stopped trusting the federal garrison and started investigating on his own. The first thing Vaughn noticed, once he laid the deeds of the 9 missing families out on his office table, was that the farms were not random. When he plotted them on a county map with black pins, borrowed from the tailor shop next door, they formed a rough arc along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, stretching 11 miles from the northern county line down to the river landing. They were among the best watered, best timbered, most productive parcels in the county. Together, they straddled the only natural corridor for any future railroad line that might be built from Boonville south toward the Ozarks. A corridor that had been surveyed in 1859 and discussed in newspapers as a near certainty once the war ended. And they were all, without exception, adjacent to land that had been acquired within the last 18 months by a single purchaser, a St. Louis land company called Pickering and Lamb Associates. Vaughn stared at that name for a long time. Pickering, the same surname as the federal captain at the garrison. Lamb, the same surname as the second missing family, whose patriarch, old Calvin Lamb, had been the most vocal opponent of wartime land speculation in the county. Calvin had gone to his neighbors in the summer of 1863, warning them not to sell their deeds to any agent of any St. Louis company under any circumstances. He'd given speeches on the courthouse steps in June and July, pounding his fist on the railing, naming names. Calvin Lamb had disappeared with his entire family on September 24th. Vaughn spent 6 hours in the county recorder's office, going through deed books. He found that Pickering and Lamb Associates had, between the spring of 1862 and the autumn of 1863, purchased 41 parcels of land in Blackwater County, all of them along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, all of them within a mile of the 9 farms that had gone empty. The purchases had been made at remarkably low prices. In several cases, the deeds had been signed over by widows whose husbands had been killed by guerrillas earlier that year, who needed cash to feed their children through the winter. In other cases, the sellers were listed as having relocated to Illinois or Iowa, though no forwarding addresses were recorded and no one in the county seemed to know where they'd gone. And in a few cases, most troublingly, the signature seminarian vergers on the deeds looked to Vaughn's eye as if they'd been written by a hand very different from the one on other county documents bearing the same name. Vaughn rode out to the Wagner place, one of the missing farms, and searched the abandoned cabin with a care he hadn't used on his first visit. He looked behind cupboards, lifted trunks, pulled back mattress ticking. In a hollow beneath a loose floorboard, under the bed in the main room, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a strip of cotton, he found a small packet of letters. They were addressed to Samuel Wagner, head of the missing family, written over 4 months between June and October 1863, and signed by an agent of Pickering and Lamb Associates named Horace Osgood, the same surname as another missing family. Vaughn sat on the edge of the Wagner's bed and read the letters in order by the slanted afternoon light. The first was polite business correspondence, offering a fair market price. The second expressed polite disappointment at Wagner's refusal and raised the offer. The third raised it again and mentioned that several neighbors had accepted similar offers and relocated to new lands in Iowa that the company had arranged to purchase for them. The fourth letter was different in tone. It mentioned Wagner's wife and children by name, asked sympathetically after the health of young Elias Wagner, who'd just started school, and observed that the countryside had become a very dangerous place for young families. It said that a man with children bore responsibilities a childless man couldn't fully understand. The fifth letter, dated September 10th, 6 days before the Hollister family vanished, spoke at length about the difficulty of protecting a rural family from bushwhackers and home guard alike, and expressed hope that Wagner would reconsider before events overtook the matter. And the sixth letter, dated October 4th, contained a single sentence that made Vaughn put his face in his hands. "We have arrangements, Mr. Wagner, that can provide for the safety of your family in exchange for your cooperation, and we would be grieved to see you refuse a kindness that others in your position have been grateful to accept." Others in your position. Vaughn rode back to town with the letters in his saddlebag. That night, in the small room he rented above the dry goods store, he began to understand. Some of the missing families had been coerced, told that bushwhackers or federal troops were coming for them, offered safe passage out of the county in exchange for signing over their deeds. They'd left in the night, walking or riding with an escort, promised new land in Illinois or Iowa. Whether any had actually made it was another question. But at least some had walked out of their cabins willingly, believing they were being saved. That was the meaning of the 4 words Vaughn would later pin to the inside of his ledger. They took them willing. The families had gone willing, led out by people they trusted or feared, believing in that first hour that they were being rescued from something worse. And the worst part was that the people leading them had known from the beginning where the road actually ended. But Vaughn didn't yet know what had happened after they left. He didn't know if they'd been put on a train or led to a quieter fate in the timber. He didn't know which neighbors were part of the scheme and which were victims. He was about to make the mistake of trying to find out. On November 22, 1863, 1 week after the Beaumont family vanished, Sheriff Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. He brought a canvas satchel with the Wagner letters, a copy of the deed records, and a list of 41 parcels he believed had been acquired by fraud or coercion. He intended to confront Pickering directly and give him one chance to explain himself before Vaughn sent the evidence to the provost marshal in Jefferson City. Pickering received him cordially, offered him coffee, listened without interrupting for 45 minutes while Vaughn laid out the evidence. He examined the deed records, read the Wagner letters slowly, one by one. When he finished, he set the last letter down, looked up at Vaughn with a small, thoughtful expression, and said, "Sheriff, I believe you've done a remarkable piece of work here. I'm going to ask you to wait in this office for 1 hour while I send for a colleague from the provost's office in Sedalia. He needs to hear this from you directly. Will you wait?" Reuben Vaughn, who had been a sheriff for 11 years and had seen men lie in 100 different ways, looked at Captain Josiah Pickering across the desk and did not see a single sign of deceit. He didn't see a single sign of anything at all. Pickering's face was as smooth and empty as a plate. Vaughn said he would wait. Pickering rose, put on his coat, and walked out. What happened in the next 40 minutes is known only from a letter Vaughn wrote that afternoon to his sister in St. Louis, which he mailed from a farmhouse 5 miles west of town after riding out of the garrison through a side gate at a flat gallop with a federal bullet through the crown of his hat. In the letter, Vaughn described hearing through the closed door of Pickering's office the captain's voice speaking quietly to a sergeant in the outer room, giving instructions that included the words "no trial," "river," and "tonight." He described understanding in a single cold moment what those 3 words meant when put together, and what they had meant on 9 previous occasions. He described climbing out the office window, dropping into an alley, working his way through the stable yard crouch behind a water troughs, stealing a cavalry horse, and riding south through the timber with 2 troopers firing revolvers at his back. He said he didn't expect to live long. He asked his sister to take the letter to a specific lawyer in St. Louis if anything happened to him, and he closed with a single sentence she would repeat for the rest of her life. "I have seen a face that belongs to the worst man I have ever met. And the worst thing about it is that it is the face of a man who believes himself to be an officer and a gentleman and who has never for one moment doubted that he is." If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark American mysteries. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten history. Now let's find out what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn discovered in the last month of his life, and what he hid, and where he hid it, so that someone might eventually find it. Vaughn didn't ride to Jefferson City. He understood that if the conspiracy reached as high as a federal captain, it probably reached higher, and that the provost marshal's office was as likely to hang him as to hear him. Instead, he rode north into the timber country along the Missouri River and disappeared into a network of old friends, fellow Masons, and distant cousins. He spent the next 3 weeks living in barns and root cellars, moving every second night, never sleeping in the same place twice. He wrote in a small leather-bound notebook, kept inside his shirt, every scrap of information he could remember, the names of the 41 parcels, the dates of each transaction, the text of the Wagner letters reconstructed from memory, the words he'd heard through Pickering's door. Then, in the first week of December, he did something nobody has ever fully understood. He rode back to Blackwater County. Not to the county seat. Not home to his wife, who didn't know if he was alive or dead. He rode instead in the middle of the night to the farm of Asa Crenshaw, the old Methodist preacher who'd been the first to find the Hollister cabin. Crenshaw took him in, fed him, and listened to his story for 4 hours by the light of a single tallow candle. When Vaughn finished, Crenshaw sat in silence